Let's talk about global supply chains and the links with corporate social responsibility strategies. Now, the justification for this concern with global supply chains is very straightforward because in a globalized world, the supply chains would involve relations with all kinds of stakeholders and with stakeholders of stakeholders, and they might become quite complex and they might offer a significant risk. Now, think about how companies, for instance, producing, well, let's imagine, I don't know, any kind of food, they buy their inputs from countries where there are some practices there which are not acceptable for the customers of the first country. So you might have a big problem there when this kind of things happen. But let's start from the beginning. Let's try, although it's not the main aim of our discussion here, to delve into the notion of supply chains. Let's start with a very simple, a very basic of a supply chain. Now, in simple terms, it's just a mapping of the relationships between different stakeholders. Now, we might start with A, can be an initial supplier that might sell something for a different and intermediate supplier that finally would get something that to a manufacturer where the production would take place. Once this production is taking place, that might go to different kind of customers, still getting to the very end. Now, this would normally involve a flow of materials in one direction and a flow of information, although for some uh, stakeholders, you can have two flows of information. But the interesting thing about a global supply chain is that these links or these chains, they might be very. So the management of that in ordinary terms would involve procurement and logistics and distribution, but then also things related to plans and to timings. And the key issue here is that all this management would involve relationships with different kinds of stakeholders. And the question is, how ethical are them? And if you have more complex chains, how would that be? Now, um, then this very abstract world, things are much more complex. So what this slide is illustrating here is that issues related to finding solutions, supply chain solution and addressing some challenges, they might involve different issues, and each of these issues would add a level of complexity, not simply because they're technically complicated, but because they might involve different stakeholders and different issues to be solved with different stakeholders. Some of these issues in a global supply chain, they are related and they can be solved personally, but others cannot, or people should travel. And if they travel, they go to different countries, they might face different cultures. Let's talk a little bit more about that. But the question is that they should adapt to things like market trends, and they should take into account different analyses that would assess the impact on the companies. So this can be, and that's the main point I would like to illustrate to you. What we start with a very simple supply chain in real life might involve all these different complexities, but in global chains, we do have different layers of complication because countries they might or companies they might produce in different countries, but they might have places of logistics in a second country and they might sell in a third country. They might decide to locate some departments. Let's imagine that a big corporation in London would like to have its financial department in Frankfurt, and perhaps the logistics would be in Beijing, and perhaps there's another office which would be about, I don't know, just guessing publicity, would be in New York. So Not simply you would be operating different countries, but you would be operating under different currencies as well. So there are many risks. The levels of complexity will depend on the levels of complication in the operation, and it depends on what kinds of things you are doing in different countries. Of course, in a global supply chain, one difficulty is that you might be operating with some companies, say in Australia, but these companies in Australia, they might buy from companies that are in Indonesia, and companies in Indonesia, they are actually buying from companies, I don't know, elsewhere. So it's a complication because ultimately, if the main reason why a company is able to offer certain goods at a certain price is because initially they were able to benefit from whatever thing that is wrong that the first company is doing. So this company would have to accept the responsibility. So the difficulties in global supply chains would be these different layers of complexity. But let's issues. Now, what are normally the usual global problems? Now, the most common of these problems when companies they have to operate in different countries would be different levels of corruption. Should they condone with paying bribes to government officials? Should they accept to engage in kinds of procurement which normally they would not engage in their own countries? Now, companies, they not simply they need guidelines, but they need protocols and governance to follow these guidelines. But normally, the issue of corruption would be the first one, followed by the issue of child labor. Now, the problem is that for many countries, child labor is just a reality, partially because countries are unable to provide public education, but also because, well, families would have many children and they would depend on whatever these children can contribute for their own survival. If they are very poor, it's very common in rural communities and especially in sub-Saharan Africa, we will find that kind of poverty, rural poverty, where children will have from the beginning, they will help their parents to fetch water because they don't have tap water, but they would have to walk sometimes, I don't know, a couple of kilometers to fetch water. So the realities are so different that they might accept this kind of child labor. So working for farms sometimes, and then supermarkets would go and would organize the production in those countries. And the reason why people are able to afford at lower prices these goods sometimes because they are prepared or they are produced with the assistance of child labor. But should people would be willing to do that? Now, this is normal, a traditional global problem. Of course, quite often there are issues or misunderstandings that might arise because companies they are operating not simply different cultures, but they have different organizational cultures. They are operating or they are collaborating with different companies that would be even under different regulatory uh, schemes. So they might have to learn how to operate under these different circumstances. And this is the standard difficulty that companies will have to face. Now, the new ones they would have to face, they are normally related to cyber threats, they are related to disruptive innovations, which are not something bad per se, but if the other companies they are promoting that kind of disruptive innovation and that if a certain company is not able to catch up, this is a big global problem. The question is what these particular companies are doing in order to catch up with the others. Another difficulty, as I mentioned to you before, since they are operating in different countries, is the volatility in global financial markets, because that might mean that there are opportunities for people inside the companies to personally benefit from this volatility. So there are ethical issues which are very strict, and guidelines that should be very strict, especially in times of high volatility in emerging economies, or if you prefer, in global financial markets. Now, these are some of the usual global problems that companies operating at a global scale they have to face. And for each of these problems, they would have to take some ethical decisions whether they should go with corruption or not, whether they should benefit from child labor or not, whether they should agree to do things that in their countries they would not be able to do, whether they would accept some threats if they are blackmailed for certain things or not, whether they would go with these innovations, where they would somehow will try to overcome them, and how they would decide when financial um, conducts are not proper. So in real life, this would happen in many different forms and colors. And here is the moment that normally in class I would read a case to you. Raul and Ian, they are fictitious names, but that is just a kind of reality that could happen to you. Just imagine that you are working for a big corporation. That corporation says, "Well, you know Spanish, yeah, so it's good. So we are just opening a branch in Mexico. Would you like to go there? You can be our manager there," and say, "Oh yes, okay, fine." Then you go to Mexico. You are opening a store there. You are in charge of the operations, and then you need a license. And then a month, 2 months, 3 months have passed, and you don't get your license. And then part of this difficulty is that people are in the headquarters. Just imagine that Ian Manking would be your ordinary senior manager, is putting pressure on you, and then you go and you speak to them. But well, you speak to them, you speak to local officials in, let's assume, Mexico City, and then the guy say, "Oh yes, but well, you know how things are done here. If you were to pay us a small bribe, you would get this thing done quickly." And then Raoul has a short conversation that Ian would not remember later. This conversation where Ian would say, "Well, do whatever you need to do in order to get this thing done." And then Raoul will do that. And based on that, later he will be promoted, he will go to London, he will get a very good position, and then within the corporation. And then someone one day would mention that the company has paid bribes in Mexico. Then it's not simply a question of role, it's a question about the whole or the ethics of the whole company. And then the company would be under threat. And then Raoul would learn that for a British company, even operating abroad, would be operating under the UK Bribery Act. So, and that he's to be judged, and his whole career now is on hold because of the something that he did. So you could be in that position in the future, deciding what's the best thing to do, and then the main point of this discussion here is that putting things on paper and being transparent and sharing things and letting the ones who have to decide and not going for the easier thing is the right thing to do, because more things can be at stake in the future. So that's the part of the discussion. Well, on dilemma, I think there's a typo there. But anyway, so the main point is that these issues, they are real issues that companies now, when it comes to culture, there are many different schemes and there are many different possibilities of interpretation. I think Hofstede is one of the most popular ones. And, and the point here is that he will say that companies operate in different countries, they might find four basic differences in culture. Now, the first is related to the fact that some companies um, they they might have their origin in countries with a more individualistic culture, and then they go to operate in countries which are more collectivist, or it can be otherwise. If you think about German or Japanese companies, and these are countries where they have a more collectivist culture, might be the case of Spain as well. So when you go to operate in a country with a more individualistic culture where things are justified more on people's self-interest, so the way that things are done, they are different. The ways and the grounds in which things are justified, even ethically, are different. And that's something that people have to understand and have to learn, that the way in which things are justified because people belong on that issue to different cultures is quite common. Now, this line normally would suggest that the Anglo-Saxon world is more based on individualistic culture, um, and you would have other cultures, as I mentioned to you, that would be more collectivist. But these things can be even more diverse, and even inside big countries such as the US, you might find part of the country which might be more collectivist than others. So this adds complexity to the issue, but that's one thing for companies to pay attention. Another thing is that uh, different countries, they have different levels, they live and people experience different levels of inequality, and these levels of inequality, they create different gaps in the power that people would have between superior and subordinates. So the way that people respond, the way that people reply to this power distance might be a cultural element as well. Now, if the distance is not meaningful, subordinates might disagree when their superiors are putting forward whatever idea. But if the distance is very high, so subordinates will always accept, or often they will accept what their superiors are suggesting. So we do have an issue here about learning how to operate in these environments. Now, Hofstede is not suggesting that you should go and change the cultures of different countries because it's impossible, but you have to try to learn and to operate with these within these differences. Yeah. A third element is the question about how much risk averse or uncertainty averse are the cultures. There are societies where uncertainty is not a problem. Yeah, although there are levels of uncertainty that are very, very high, such as the one we have now about the coronavirus, but there are societies that handle well and that they know how to respond to questions of uncertainty. But there are other societies where people simply try to avoid uncertainty, so they are very averse to uncertainty. The way that people respond to uncertainty is different. The way that companies respond to uncertainty is different as well. Now, you might see now just as something additional, you might see now how some companies are simply firing their employees and others are trying to engage them differently based on the crisis, even companies in the same sector. So the way that they are handling uncertainty is different. So some of them embrace uncertainty and they see that as part of the game. Others company cannot cope with uncertainty. So this is something which has an individual perspective, but also it has some cultural uncertainty. And the final thing, which is just borderline, is a thing related between the masculinity femininity divide, and that is about discrimination. Now, there are different levels of discrimination of women, and not simply of women, but people can be discriminated for different reasons, but that they have a cultural element of that. Now, it's interesting because a cultural element means that most people in that place would have that kind of view. But this does not mean that this view would be correct. In this case of discrimination, surely not, and people can be discriminated for other things, and all of them can be borderline of not being legal. Just think about sexual harassment. So at the end of this road, the line that would define elements that can be culturally tolerated or not will depend very much on the policy and the governance. So what would be the normal thing? The normal would be self-reference, whatever the company defines within its code of conduct, within its policy, you would separate between us and them, and but would be the main criteria that would be used in order to assess them. Now, who in this case would be them? Would be the stakeholders in our supply chain or in our global supply chain. But again, this adds layers of complexity because in this case here, it's much harder to operate when we have chains that might be in different countries and different people doing different things. Now, there are several strategies that companies can follow. I'm going to highlight the one that has been the first and the most important and the most outstanding because it anticipated several of the things we are seeing today, such as the Sullivan Principles, but also the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, but let me say very briefly about the others just for you to have an idea. Now, the Global Compact was just what the United Nations organized when they had the Millennium Development Goals around 2000, 1999, and then they decided that the companies should help with this effort of achieving these goals up to 2015. And they have been replaced by the SDGs, by the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals. We are going to talk more about them later. I'm actually posting two links to you, one on the Sullivan Principles and the other on SDGs, just for you to have an idea. So about uh, what they are offering. But the Global Compact was the idea that companies they might help to achieve things such as poverty reduction, such as helping equality in enrollment in children at school, or things like sanitation, or things normally relate to health and education, or a standard of living, as it would be the case of poverty. Now, other strategies are followed, such as the US Corrupt Practices Act or the UK Bribery Act, because they guide companies in these countries about what they can and what they cannot do, even when they are operating abroad. As I mentioned to you, if we have a British company operating, I don't know, in the Philippines, if they do something wrong there, they are going to be judged according to the UK Bribery Act. So, but there are so many other things from WHO, from ISO, from GRI. We have discussed some of them. I just wanted to mention that the notion of ISO, the International Standards Organization, they are subdivided according to the protocols they follow. So we have the 14,000 for sustainability, and we have the 26,000 for social responsibility. And they provide clarity for other stakeholders. Just imagine that you are a shareholder and you would like to invest, or you would like to build a portfolio with companies that respect the environment. If you see that a company would have the ISO 14000, you know that in order to get this ISO certain protocols have to be followed. So it's a guarantee, it's a question of transparency. As companies and their activities and their global supply chains they become more complex, as things that you are going to buy in your supermarket they are produced all over in the world, or things that you are going to, if you are going to IKEA, which is one of our case studies. I'm going to talk more about IKEA now shortly. Uh, if you see that that might come from all over the world, you want to have some guarantee that somehow the practices that have been used in the whole production process, including uh, other suppliers and including the whole chain, that they have followed certain standards. And if you see that you have this ISO, then well, okay, yeah, they should be doing something good. So it's a question of transparency, it's a question of communication. Quite often, the companies they would define their codes of conduct and their principles based on some of these strategies. So let's talk more specifically about the Sullivan principles. Now, right now, it would be nice if you could see first the live of in the video that I have shared with you of Sullivan. You would understand better the principles that are here. But if you don't, just do this PowerPoint first and then later you can watch. But it would be nice if you could stop here, watch there, and then come back because you would see the historical relevance of that. Now, the main point of Sullivan is that he was able to talk about things as we are still discussing today. He was talking about universal human rights, and he was saying, look, employees, communities, we should respect their human rights. People, independently from their color, race, gender, age, ethnicity, or religious beliefs, they should be respected. So there are certain things that companies should not do to people, such as physical punishment. Would you imagine today if an employee is not achieving certain targets of productivity, say, that someone is going to be punished physically for that? So this seems to be a preposterous idea. But these were things that were done before, such as female abuse, although this is still the case that companies have to fight against. But there are many other forms of abuse that when Sullivan was saying in the context of Ford, but I don't want to anticipate that how this has spread to the whole automobile industry. So is the question of how this was it for the General Motors? Now I just got in doubt of which one, but hopefully one of them, yes. But then it was widespread to the whole automobile industry and then to the other corporations in the West. And then this implied the use of some criteria based on things like the Human Rights Chart of the United Nations. And this would imply that also employees would have to see their rights for freedoms of association respected and things related to what would be their additional basic needs. So you could say, oh, was this only about the workplace? No, not really. The workplace was his main emphasis was that people who would be working for these companies would have their rights respected as stakeholders. So it is indeed mostly a question of having a proper environment to work, but it's also taking care of the environment in a broader sense. So Sullivan was one of the first to talk about sustainable development for companies that they would have to promote sustainable development. So the main point is that all these criteria would have an external anchor, and that would be extended to things such as respect for property rights, not accepting bribes. So it was all there. And things like promoting fair competition as well. So uh, the whole list of principles is not very different from the things we have today, and there are still many companies in the US that they adopt the Sullivan principles. But for the extension of most of the problems we have discussed, the ethical problems that companies would have to face, we see it's the question of applying those principles for all stakeholders or with whom we do business, as Sullivan uh, would say. So issues related to the workplace, to the communities where people are, but also to the supply chain and to the global supply chain, as you will see in the video. I don't want to anticipate that. They have all been part of this set of principles that we today. Now, uh, then now is the moment that you should go and check the other link that I sent to you, or the links related to sustainable development goals. In these links, you will find what the sustainable development goals are about, and how companies are using the sustainable development goals. And think that whatever companies choose, whatever they adapt in terms of their codes of conduct, they are international standards that companies can easily use to solve the issue of lack of criteria. But of course, reality is much harder than that. And that's why that I'm suggesting to you this article about IKEA. So it's an article telling especially how IKEA is handling the issue of global supply chains, and you will find also many theoretical elements that we have discussed in that article. And there's an issue about how IKEA has handled um, its investments in Russia and the sort of difficulties that IKEA has found. So I'm going to put a question for you later. So the exercise we'll have this week is related to that. But but I hope that what is the taking stock? So let's go and try to take stock of what I have present to you. Now I hope uh, that it's clear to you at least three things. The first one, that nowadays when big corporations they have to operate in different parts of the world, that they are actually handling global supply chains. They have to handle, they have to learn how to operate ethically with global supply chains, and that this is much harder. So that's the first thing to do. That some of these issues they involve cultural issues. So it's important that companies they have protocols to disentangle some issues would have ethical significance and issues that are cultural, and even how some of these cultural issues might be ethical issues for them. So it's up to the corporations to decide that. Of course, and that's the third thing to call your attention, is that quite often this depends on a sort of intersubjective understanding, and that's why companies would use all kinds of protocols and guidelines and tools such as ISO and the GRI, or even the Sullivan principles or the SDGs, and how they have to operate under bribery acts and all the legal constraints they have. So operating with global supply chains is not easy, and companies they need to define clear guidelines to do that. But this is not simply about the companies, this is about you. This is about you being able to understand that in your case as well, you might be in a position of Raul, and you might be in a position to have to decide what to do working for one of these big corporations. So I hope this is clear to you. I'm available 24/7 for um, emails, and we are going to have our discussion session on that as well using Teams, and where I'm going to explain the exercise to you. But please do watch the videos that go with SDGs and the Sullivan Principle, and also the article that I'm attaching to it. Okay, so take care.